Where are you watching this from? What time is it where you are? Are you near church bells? Do you still go to service? Does the taste of red juice still carry warmth for you, or does it turn bitter in your mouth? If stories like this move through your bones, if dark history and long memory call out louder than any fiction, then take this moment to subscribe to the channel. We uncover what history tried to bury, one reckoning at a time. July 26, 1840, Charleston District, South Carolina. It was a Sunday, and it was hot, not regular hot, purgatory hot, the kind that wraps around the throat like a leather strap and sits on chests like guilt. In a whitewashed chapel built by black hands, 6 white planters stood from their seats and lifted polished silver goblets toward their mouths. It was the body of Christ, they said. It was salvation in a cup. It was holy. It was right. It was tradition. But this time the wine wasn't for the soul. It was for the grave. David. That was the name on no one's lips that day. But he was there in the walls, the floorboards. He was woven into the day like shadow to light. David, 27, tall, lean, spine carved by whips, hands grained like wood. He didn't speak, not much, didn't whistle, didn't joke outside deep night among the trees. He worked the chapel. That was his role. That was his mask. He kept the linens white, the candles upright, and the communion set clean enough to see your sins in it. The other slaves sweeping between cracked pews called him the quiet one. The mistress called him smooth-headed. The planters called him boy. But within that silence, beneath that pressed cotton shirt, and behind those black, observant eyes, David remembered everything. That morning, the world smelled of lye soap, iron, muddy tobacco leaves, and a sun that had no mercy to give. Zion's chapel stood at the edge of the cotton rows, raised on stone, boasting a red front door painted every spring. It was the planters' pride, a symbol of their godliness. But it had a soul shaped like a noose, and a tongue that licked blood from its own chalice. David walked the center aisle at dawn. He wiped spit from the front pulpit. He dusted hymnals with a dried cotton blossom. Under his breath, he recited no psalm. Only names, only sorrow, only promises made. The chapel bell rang 5 times, not a song, a warning. From the window he saw William Holst step out of his buggy, mean and proud in a red coat. Holst always left his boots muddy on purpose, just to make David bow. Behind him, Nathaniel Kittrell limped up the steps, his walking cane biting every plank like a viper's fang. Isaiah Black, former sea captain, now plantation lord, smoothed his beard and carried his Bible like a weapon, not a word. Reverend. Ernest Hale came last, with crosses stitched across his collar and secrets stitched even deeper in his vest. Samuel Greer and Jonas Lee, twins in crime, smiling with the smugness of men who think they've already won. 6 men, 1 table, 1 cup, and David. He was the one meant to serve them their holiness. But this time, he was preparing something else. He swept the aisle, polished the silver plate until it caught the light just right, laid out the white cloth, washed the cups with well water cold enough to sting the knuckles. To everyone else, it looked the same. Just another Sunday, just another service. Just another boy doing his job. But inside David the fire had started. The same fire that burned behind the eyes of his mother Reba, long gone beneath the sugarcane rows, where dogs found her limp and broken. The same fire that couldn't, save his sister Annalise, last seen taken into Kittrell's shed during a summer thunderstorm. She never walked the quarters again. David had washed blood off the Reverend's white robes once, when Hale struck a slave woman into miscarriage behind the pulpit. He had seen too much. He had said nothing. So he watched. He listened, and he waited. That morning the silver chalice reflected 6 faces and 1 quiet storm. Every task David did, he did twice. He didn't fill the jug once. He did it again. For precision. He didn't dust the altar once. He did it again. For control. Because he knew weeks in advance they would all be there that morning. That service, that ceremony, that final taste. No one noticed the shift in his breath. No one saw the way he touched the communion table like carved stone, not wood. No one watched the way his fingers paused over the bottle just a breath too long. But David knew something they didn't. The Lord's table wasn't theirs anymore. It was his. Every plank scrubbed clean by broken backs. Every cup polished by trembling hands that had buried too many. Every hymn hummed with mouths too afraid to speak. That wasn't worship. That was a funeral waiting to admit itself. And David had finally decided who would be buried. Where does a man keep names when no one lets him speak them? If you're watching this right now, take 5 seconds and type the name of someone your family once whispered about. Someone forgotten. Someone buried in story but not in soul. The story of David is heavy because it carries others. This chapter is for them. Before there was a chalice, before there was poison, before there were pews full of gasping planters, there were 3 names: Reba, Annalise, Jude. David remembered each one like thunder in his bones. That's how it works. When the world teaches you early that survival means soundlessness. He didn't remember stories, he remembered smells. The scent of his mother's scarf in winter, burnt soap and mule sweat, the tobacco under Jude's nails, the sugar water Annalise used to rub into her braids. Memory didn't live in words. It lived in objects, in blood, in bruises they didn't let heal. David was born behind New River Baptist Plantation, McPherson Parish County line. December. 1912, coldest December on the records. His mother Reba birthed him beneath tarp and straw in the livestock shed. They called her milk-blooded, strong, sharp-minded. Too smart, some overseers said. She was punished often for knowing too much and showing even less. At 13, David watched her shoulders split open under Greer's switch for contesting God. Her crime? Quoting scripture back more accurately than Reverend Hale could. She didn't cry. She just turned her head and whispered, "One day, one of you gonna bleed in God's own house, and my boy will pour the cup." David heard her say it, once, just once, but it burned into him like the heat from the forge. Annalise was next. Just 2 years younger, lighter-skinned, voice sweet like warm molasses. She used to sing to babies born without names, and David used to sit next to her while she combed corn silk into straw dolls. They were always together. Where one went, the other followed, until the day she didn't come back. It was the summer of 1831, July storm. Lightning cracked the cane fields. The ground went thirsty even when it rained. That's when Nathaniel Kittrell called for her, just after supper. He always called for the pretty ones before storms. He liked screaming to get swallowed by thunder. She never returned. The next morning, her work apron lay in the mud, stained brown. David stared at it until his knees buckled. Mistress Lee said she was moved to another district. But the mourners in the cabin knew. That night, they sang Deep River through bruised lips, through clenched jaws. David sang nothing. He lay on his back, blinkless, watching the rafters tremble. There were no tears, only a vow. He stopped making dolls after that. Didn't laugh, didn't climb trees. Just work, just silence, just eyes that refused to forget. Then there was Jude, his cousin, older, strong as a bull, the only one who dared look the master in the eye. He taught David how to hide a blade in a boot heel, how to track without noise, how to fake a limp to miss the hardest whipping days. Jude was freedom in a body, but freedom like that never stays free long. He tried to run twice. Second time, they caught him half a mile past the creek bed. Near the burnt trunk of a lightning tree, they dragged him back, Captain Isaiah. Black personally oversaw the branding, thief, carved into his back with a fire poker, while 2 boys held him face down. They called it mercy. He got to live, but on the inside, Jude died that day. He didn't yell, didn't beg, didn't curse. He just looked at David and said, "This ain't your ending, cousin. You hear me? You ain't meant for weeping. When your day comes, you put it in the cup." That line, over and over, that line. By winter, Jude starved himself, 3 weeks without bread. By the time they noticed he wasn't eating, he'd already broken down too far to breathe. David dug his grave near the hog line with a dull hoe. 6 feet of earth, no cross. Just a broken tobacco pipe beside the body. David never forgot. He remembered every face that stood and watched, every whisper behind hands, every sermon Hale gave about order and divine roles after sin. He polished those pews that held Jude's torment. He swept the altar stained with the smile of Kittrell. He filled the wine they drank with clean water drawn by the unclean. He shook with rage that never made sound. And when Holst began bringing new girls to serve in the chapel, when Jonas Lee spat chewing grease onto David's clean cloth without a word of apology, when Samuel Greer twisted a child's ear so hard the lobe tore apart like wet paper, that was when the silence broke. Not outward, not loud, but a cracking inside his chest that echoed for weeks. He began walking differently, straight back, slow feet, no more flinching. He began praying, not to their God, but to one with Reba's voice, a God who didn't wear white. He started visiting the shade of the cypress trees beyond the cane. Rose where dead things rested, where he first said the names aloud again. Reba, Jude, Annalise, Reba, Jude, Annalise. He said them every morning. He said them while folding linens. He said them while scrubbing oil from the chapel lamp. He said them while watching the planters laugh. Each name was a chapter, and he was the final verse. And when he met Mona, the midwife of broken things, everything shifted. She saw him standing there, inside wind and shadow, and said, "Your hands shake less now. Means the time come. You want memory or blood?" "Both," he said. "In a cup." She gave him a leather pouch, small, soft as sleep. Inside, a powder made of ash tree roots, crushed wasp nest, dry venom from a snake, deadly when stirred, silent on the tongue, takes its time. David took it, said little, walked back to Zion Chapel as if nothing stirred inside him. But something was already dying, not in him, in them. This was never about hate, it was about remembrance. For every hymn Annalise never sang, for every sermon Reba wasn't allowed to finish, for every step Jude didn't get to take, and so David worked and waited and poured name after name into each quiet task, until one morning the church bell rang 5 times, and the wine sat on the table, waiting to stain every mouth that had ever stolen breath. The names were in the dirt, but their vengeance was coming in the cup. The wine had always been red, red like blood, red like bruises, red like the backs of boys called too wild. David poured it every Sabbath without error, without thought. But after that spring, after Ezra, the boy with knees they broke for humming too loud in the Lord's house, after his smothered cries behind the sugar barn, after the flies that gathered in his cracked lips, the wine started to look like something else. Not Christ's blood, not mercy, but an answer. Ezra was 12. David found him hunting songs between hymnals 2 weeks before. Small kid, big voice, scars still fresh, bare toes always curled beneath his too short pants. He wasn't blood, but that never mattered. When Samuel Greer cornered the preacher after the spring feast and said, "That boy needs shaping," he too bowled for his own skin. They tied Ezra to the white fence behind Zion's chapel. 3 planters took turns. He screamed only once, then bit down so hard on his own lip, the blood dripped onto his chest like wax. David was forced to watch, with his hands folded, clean shirt on, silver goblet tucked under his arm, like the service still mattered. That night, David couldn't sit, couldn't sleep. He walked past the edge of the slave quarters, barefoot until his feet bled. And when he knelt in the woods beneath the cross-hung elm tree, he didn't pray, he whispered, "You stopped me from crying. Now you better show me how to burn." The cypress around him swayed. Owls blinked without movement. Even silence watched. That was when she stepped through smoke and dusk. Like she'd always been watching, Mona. People feared her in daylight, but sought her in secret. Her cabin sat nailed together, with rusted iron and bone. She wore nothing but grey, linen, and wrapped her face in mosquito net even at night. But her eyes were deep holes with memory at the bottom. Mona listened when David spoke, didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't rush. She sat and stirred whatever boiled in her pot and let the anger fall out of his jaw like rotten teeth. He told her about Ezra, About Annalise, Jude, Reba. He told her about the silver. He told her about the cup. Mona didn't smile. She said, "Then it sounded to me like you already knowing what justice look like. It looked like a man walking into church with silence between his teeth. It looked like offering them the same peace they offered. Yours." She handed him a small leather sachet inside powdered tree bark. Bitter as regret, snake venom dried into flakes, a pinch of crushed yew, a whisper of dust from her husband's grave, she claimed, and something else. Something that smelled like the edge of a scream. Once mixed, you got 2 hours maybe, less if the wine hot. Let 'em sip slow. David held the sachet like a borrowed breath, then folded it into his shirt lining. Mona didn't ask for thanks. "Just aim steady," she said, "and say their names while they drop." For 4 weeks, David barely slept. He focused on patterns. When the planters came, when they left. When the communion bottle was refilled. Who drank when? Who lingered after? How Reverend Hale signaled for service to begin. He watched the goblets, memorized every handprint, every habit. Captain Isaiah Black always drank slow, head tilted, prideful. Holst drank fast like he'd earned it. Hale coughed after every sip. Every time. The Lee brothers laughed with wine still in their teeth. Every little detail became a constraint, a timing gear. Because David knew this couldn't be clumsy. It had to sing. It had to echo. It had to touch every single one of them without missing a mouth. He began cleaning the communion silver more obsessively, buffed the goblets with his mother's old rag. Put 4 drops of Coldwell, water into the base of the bottle every time. No taste change, no scent detectable. He even tested the poison on a stray piglet behind the smokehouse, mixed it in leftover red, muscadine wine. The creature sipped from the puddle, trembled, drooled, fell, breath shaky for 23 minutes before it went. Still perfect. That night, he sat behind the chapel after curfew and watched the stars rotate over the cane. He peeled bark with his thumbnail and whispered again, "Reba, Jude, Annalise, Ezra, I remember. Y'all wait for me just a little longer here." The plan was simple. The morning, July 26, set the cups like always. Mix the poison into the wine cellar bottle. Pour evenly. Let them drink. Let the wine burn their lies. He kept the sachet folded inside the hem of an old sock, placed it just beneath his pillow in the quarters. He touched it every morning, not for comfort, for clarity. He wasn't afraid. He didn't doubt they had made him deaf with screams. Now he would make them listen in silence. He waited for the last sign and got it 3 days before the service. William Holst had a new girl, barely 15, Mexican, bought from a broker in Charleston. She didn't speak English, couldn't signal help. Holst paraded her through the aisles of the chapel while Reverend Hale smiled blankly. That night, the girl ran. 2 dogs, 2 men, and 1 lantern were sent after her. By morning, they nailed her dress to the chapel door, blood still on. Git pinned like a crucifixion. None of them cried. They just smirked. That was the final cut. David didn't cry. He just folded his clean clothes, bathed, and pressed his hair with oil scented faintly with pine ash. The next morning, he took the bottle down into the wine cellar, twisted it open, and poured memory inside. There is a kind of quiet before a storm that doesn't feel like peace. Feels like vengeance sharpening its edge. That was the quiet that followed David. It was under his shoes behind his eyes. Inside the voices that spoke no more but waited, patient as earth. When the wine bottle was corked again, the chapel dark, the silver clean, and the lobby candles flickering, David whispered 3 words into the air. Let them drink. Sunday, July 26, 1840. The air hung thick, like a wet cloth over the mouth of the world. Humidity wrapped the chapel like burial gauze. The heat had a sound to it, a hiss, rising from the red clay, the stone steps, the black bodies forced into clean collars. The chapel bell rang its 5 heavy notes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 each. Ring felt like a countdown. Each ring felt like a name. Reba, Jude, Annalise, Ezra, and one more for the silence they all endured. David entered the chapel through the back. As always, starched shirt, slight limp. Still and unreadable. He had already poured the wine, 6 silver goblets, perfect alignment. Each filled even, no spills, no stains. The bottle had been doctored hours before, deep in the wine cellar, beneath layers of hymns and lies. Poison mixed slowly. One motion clockwise. It was never meant to be fast, it was meant to be, felt steady, quiet, certain. Like the roots of cypress trees threading through buried bones. Slaves were expected to remain out of sight during communion. David took position behind the organ curtain, where the shadows bloomed. He wasn't hiding, he was witnessing. They all came in, as they always did. William Holst, red coat, gold buttons, cane tapping like a gavel, Nathaniel Kittrell wheezing, sour from drink and hate, Captain Isaiah Black, with war medals gleaming beside his Bible, Reverend Ernest Hale, lips greased with gospel and cowardice, Samuel Greer, chewing something slimy, and Jonas Lee, grinning like a thief in church. Each man stood tall, arrogant, pure in their own eyes. The congregation stood with them, black hands shaking open hymnals, white gloves creased tight around pride, children shifting beneath stiff ribbon bows. David could smell everything, the sweat under Greer's collar, the nervous lavender oil from Mistress Hale, the sourness of stale tobacco on Captain Black's breath. The blood memory soaked into the floorboards. Wasn't a church anymore. It was a stage set for consequence. Reverend Hale gave the sermon. A dry fire. Ash without flame. He called the Lord merciful. He called obedience divine grace. He called the planters chosen stewards of Christian soil. David watched a girl flinch in the third row. Young, barely formed. Already broken. She looked just like Annalise before her spirit went quiet. Hale raised the goblet, said the line, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this in remembrance of me." One by one, they lifted the silver. They hadn't earned the remembrance, but they were about to be remembered forever. William Holst drank first. He tilted his head back, gulped deep, licked his lips like the wine was ripe. His collapse was slow. Then sudden eyes rolled up, mouth crooked sideways. He made one sound like a choking bell, then dropped forward over the communion table. His tongue turned black, gasps, screams. A cup shattered. Kittrell fumbled his Bible. "Something ain't," he began, but words failed. He clutched his chest, grasped his cane, dropped like a clothesline, dead weight hitting the stone floor. People screamed. David didn't blink. Greer reached for help, but his hand curled in like a crushed spider. His mouth foamed. He gagged, once, then slumped across the second pew. Jonas Lee couldn't even make a sound. His head twitched left, right, left, like a puppet missing its master. Blood vessels burst in his throat. He fell sideways into a child and took the bench down with him. Isaiah Black stumbled out of the row, barreled toward the altar. He tried to vomit, tried to pray. His lips moved, but nothing holy came out. He made it to the steps before he collapsed, arm locked in rigor, pointing straight at the cross. Reverend Hale dropped next, still standing, still preaching. He forced himself to drink, trying to break the evil spell. But it wasn't a spell, it was rage. Poured into the mouth of liars, he crumbled into his own. Vestments like dirty laundry set aflame. 6. Came 6 were gone, 1 for Reba, 1 for Annalise, 1 for Jude, 1 for Ezra, 1 for each scream that went unanswered, and 1 for... David's silence followed the screaming, a silence filled with the wet breath of disbelief. Someone dropped a hymnal. Outside, the wind shifted, and the smell of salt and rust filled the air like a sign. People looked for David. He stepped out from behind the curtain, not crouched, not hiding, just walking, smooth, slow. His skin caught the golden, pain from the stained glass Jesus. For a second, he turned holy in the light. No slave panicked, no child moved. Even the master's mistresses stood pinned to the pews, too terrified to flinch. David looked at the altar like it owed him something. He didn't speak, didn't scream, didn't boast. He just stood where Hale once stood and stared the survivors down like a ghost they could now see. He lifted one goblet, the last untouched one, held it high, then shattered it on the floor. The sound was final, like a hammer falling, like a vow kept. He turned, walked down the center aisle, past the stunned bodies, past open mouths frozen in prayerless horror. No one dared touch him. He passed the door, past the chapel, gates into the field, then into the woods. They say he vanished. Their scenes gone into the swamps near Savage Creek, where Spanish moss drowns all tracks, and snakes know better than to bite names heavy with. Justice stories followed. Children in the slave quarters whispered he became water. Others said the trees protected him. Some said he walks still, where wine is served by liars, and the scent of Reba still lingers. They never used that chapel again. No one would touch the pews. No one would touch the silver. They buried the 6 planters in separate graves, unmarked, because legends don't need a headstone to curse the land they left behind. The breeze that followed David into the woods didn't feel like wind. It felt like a breath, held long by the world, finally let out. Like the land itself sighed. 6 names, dead and rotting beneath communion robes, and one man walking, not running, into the forest like he belonged to the old things. No overseer ran after him, not because they were merciful, because they saw something that day, something alive in silence. For days, the chapel stood empty, pews twisted from the weight of memory, wine stains darkened floors like shadow blood. Nobody touched the silver. Nobody refilled the goblets. Nobody dared ring the bell again, not once. Instead, the stories grew. Whispers passed through cane fields before sunrise. David poured death into the Lord's cup. He was Reba's boy. He drank fire and spit judgment. They say his feet didn't leave tracks after the chapel. They say the trees bent to hide him. The planters buried their own in unblessed ground. Quiet graves. No cross, no stone. They feared public scandal, chose secrecy, told the Charleston papers it was fever, told the mistresses it was curse, told the other masters that God sometimes moves in strange ways. But in the quarters, the truth stayed sharp, sharper than any whip, because it had meaning. David became a name passed down with care. Mothers stitched the letter D inside the belts of their sons. Fathers named mules after him. Children hummed the communion song, off-key, then smiled hard. Songs changed lyrics. A cup for the rich, sip slow, let it burn. David walked silent, won't ever return. At fire pits, in hush meetings, during stolen moments between toil and fear, they told his story, until it became gospel. Not for justice, for memory. What happened after? Some say he drowned. The marsh swallowed him, same as it swallows bones. Others claimed he made it west, working under a false name, refused liquor, refused church, only whittled crosses from cedar and gave them to boys who didn't speak much. A former field hand swore she saw him in Savannah in 1851, coat too clean, eyes too tired. She said he sold her a horseshoe. She said he never looked her in the face, but when her baby cried, he whispered, Ezra. Then walked into the fog. Reverend Hale's son rebuilt the chapel, with new cups, new floors, but no communion had the same sweetness. Every wine after that tasted strange, and every Sunday felt like a countdown. The new bell refused to chime properly, kept sounding off-beat, as though it was tolling for someone still walking. The whitewashed cross above the altar fell one day, during a sermon, landed hard, split down the center. No one picked it up. They said that's what happens when you preach over unburied truth. Some people ask, why poison? Why not a gun, a knife, a runaway escape like others? Because David wasn't escaping. He was communicating. He used their symbols, the blood, the cup, the ceremony, and poured resistance into them. He made the lie choke itself. He let them sip salvation and find pain. He made them kneel before their own sin, and he didn't touch a soul to do it. Today, If you walk near old Zion's ruins, hidden now behind kudzu and silence, you'll find a cracked cornerstone, scorched faint at the base. Locals say no grass will grow properly there. Birds don't nest in its rafters. Even the rain avoids it. Those who know say it's sacred. Still, not because of God, because of David, because silence deserves a temple, because quiet fury leaves a scar. Kings can't erase. Legacy isn't in fire. It's in what remains after fire. David's story survived not on paper, but in needlework, in lullabies, in warnings spoken at night by those who knew what it cost to hope and who never stopped hoping. He poured memory back into the throat of a ritual that tried to erase it, and in doing so, reminded the world that even the softest mouth can sometimes speak last. If this story struck something inside you, it's because it isn't over. History doesn't end where the textbook closes. It ends where silence is broken, where communion becomes confrontation, and where wine becomes wrath. Subscribe and share with someone who still believes in the power of a name, because if they don't remember David, they will never understand what it means to endure and deliver reckoning in 6 silent sips. Case closed.